amongst other things, I focus on climate change. And there's a lot of reasons I think to be concerned about waste energy incineration, but particularly I want to bring up some concerns I've got around carbon emissions from waste energy, and try to highlight some things that I don't think have been covered in the report as I've seen it, which I think need a little bit more attention. So I'm going to try to go through this relatively quickly, but I'd be happy to answer any questions if you've got them at the end. So I start off with 1 million tons of CO2 a year, and that's an estimate of how much carbon dioxide would be released by the combination of the Burnaby incinerator and new incineration facilities. That's extrapolated from the AECOM report, and that includes organics and fossil-derived carbon. So just as a starting point, Metrovan and BC, as you well know, I'm sure, have a 33% reduction target by 2020, and I'm questioning how we can justify going ahead with this project based on that commitment. Just to put it in context, we've got an aggressive target, but if you actually look at what the United Nations International Panel on Climate Change is telling us, we basically need to completely eliminate carbon dioxide in Canada by 2050. We need to do about an 80 to 90% reduction below 1990 levels by 2050, according to the United Nations. And of course, our emissions have gone up 30% since 1990 in Canada. So we find ourselves in a situation where we really do need to be thinking quite seriously about our actions and the investments we make, especially ones that have the lifetime of a project like this one. Now, to put in perspective what we're considering, this is from a U.S. Environmental Protection Agency report from 2008. You can see that waste incineration actually produces more carbon dioxide per kilowatt hour of power generated than even a coal-fired power plant. So here we are in BC, that's basically hydropower, and we're talking about building facilities that actually, for producing electricity, actually produce more greenhouse gases than a coal-fired power plant or any other form of fossil fuel-based energy production. So currently, the Burnaby incinerator, this is from the AECOM report, produces 323 tons of CO2, that includes organics, or 1,116 tons of CO2 just from fossil fuel-derived emissions. Now these are big numbers, and they're sometimes hard to wrap your head around, so I just want to translate that into something that everybody can associate themselves with. The Hummer is kind of the symbol of being irresponsible in terms of climate change. So if you wanted to produce the same amount of emissions from driving a Hummer, you'd need 730 people to drive a Hummer from Burnaby to Toronto and back again every week for a year to create the same amount of emissions just from the fossil fuel-derived emissions. So I find it useful to put it in some sort of a story form, just to put those numbers in perspective. Now, what we're talking about doing, if either scenario 1 or scenario 2, is actually tripling the emissions that we'd see produced in the region. And I've broken that out to what you would see with scenario 1 is 1.2 million tons of carbon, or 0.9 million tons of carbon. That's including the organics, or the numbers you see there, 450 or 340 just from the fossil-derived carbon. Now, I think there's a reason why we should be looking not just at the fossil-derived carbon. The province requires that all our electricity be greenhouse gas free by 2016. I wonder how we're going to make this a reality. Waste energy could have Metrovan emitting CO2 with this new facility to make it the #2 emitter in the province and the #1 in the lower mainland, if you include the organics. Or if you don't include the organics, it would still be in the top 5 emitters in the province. The reason why I think we should be including the organics, or the biogenic CO2 emissions, is because the United Nations tells us to. As you can see in the bolded section of the text here, if incineration of waste is used for energy purposes, both fossil and biogenic CO2 emissions should be estimated. So I think if we're not including the biogenic carbon, we're actually not following the rules of how you're supposed to calculate carbon emissions according to the United Nations. But either way, I think it's a big step in the wrong direction. You're supposed to laugh at that slide. Thank you.
Been a long day.
The next slide here is a letter that we received from Blair Lackstrom, and the highlighted portion you'll see at the end is, in the case of West Energy facilities located in the province, this would require the use of greenhouse gas emission offsets for any emissions that may result from the conversion of plastics to energy. So he's focusing on the fossil-derived carbon, but he's clearly saying that these new waste energy facilities are going to require carbon offsets. So the question I want to ask is, who's paying for the offsets and how much would it cost? If we're serious about being carbon neutral, I think we need to look carefully at what these offsets would actually look like, and I haven't seen any reference to that in the report. So what I did was I took the offsetter.ca website, and basically they have 2 different portfolios. There's a gold standard in their general portfolio, which is at either $20 a ton or $30 a ton. $30 a ton, just to put in perspective, is the price that the carbon tax would reach by 2012. So let's just use the $30 a ton number. That would be $30 million if you include that 1 million tons a year. So that's $30 million a year in offsets, which I'm not sure who's paying for. But even if you want to take the cheapest option, the $20, and use the smaller number, which is the 340,000 tons of CO2, you still have $6,800,000, which I don't see any plan for who's paying for it. And then, of course, there's the question of would these offsets actually even reduce carbon emissions? There's been a lot of stories recently about major scandals related to carbon offsets. There's groups that have put out reports that say that we can't trust these offsets as a way to ensure that emissions are reduced. And you know, it's even been equated with this cute picture here that it's kind of like the new snake oil. Like carbon offsets have given us this whole new market, and potentially there's a lot of problems with it. One of the biggest ones I can highlight, just to throw one out there, is if you look at what Offsetter.ca highlights on their website in terms of the emissions that were released during the Olympics and what offsets were put towards, a lot of it was actually related to burning biogenic carbon-based materials. It was for turning wood chip into electricity, either through fuel switching at the Lafarge cement plant or by investing in research and development for different companies that are working on the technology. So even just right off the top, looking at what Offsetter.ca is doing and then comparing it to what the United Nations is telling us, I have a really hard time seeing how we're going to get an absolute reduction in emissions from the offsets as they exist right now in British Columbia. So it's just kind of an ending point, and I actually went through this faster than I thought I would. I think really the question we need to ask ourselves is, do we want to be providing fossil fuels in British Columbia for energy? You know, this would lock the Metro Vancouver region into providing a regular source of fossil fuel for energy production in a province that I think is the model right now of how to do energy right, where 90% of our power is coming from hydropower. We made decisions a long time ago that I think have actually quite benefited the people of British Columbia. And if we commit to this, we're going to have contracts that say you need to continue to provide feedstock, fossil-based feedstock for energy production, and to do it in a way that actually produces more greenhouse gases than a coal-fired power plant as we move forward. Thank you.
Thank you. There is a couple questions. I'll just ask you one question. If waste energy isn't the solution, and we all around this table will agree we need to get to zero waste, but I think we can all agree we're not going to get there tomorrow or in the next couple of years. What's your solution to dealing with the residuals?
Well, I mean, there's no easy solution to it, but I can tell you that you're a lot better off not burning plastics than burning them. So if and landfills can at least be scaled down, whereas with an incinerator you're stuck with an ongoing feedstock guarantee. So as much as I'm not a fan of landfills, I do think that responsible landfilling is probably the best stopgap measure for the time being. Ultimately I think this is about getting serious about waste production. I think the 70% number isn't high enough that's in the report. I think you should be getting serious about getting to much higher numbers. And if we're investing this much time and energy and capital into this, I think we're actually short-sighted in the sense that we're not actually putting the resources that we need to into dealing with the material problems, into doing the research and development to actually